This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, so now we're very pleased to welcome Jessica Bugs of University of East Anglia, where she is a senior lecturer in environmental development. She's a human geographer by training, and she works on political economies of water and gardens. She has an interest in how power relations shape water flows, patterns of access, policies and resources. Her main areas of engagement have been the application of economic and market principles to water management and the liberalisation of the agriculture and mining sectors in Latin America. She recently had an SRC grant that explored the connections between the growth of mining and the changing water sector in the Peruvian Andes. So very topical and relevant to today's discussions.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma, and to the organisers for having me. I've only got 15 minutes, which isn't actually that long when you're sat up here, so I'll cover some issues in relation to water.
I'm very sorry, we have 15 minutes before the lunch hour that we were going to have, but we're extending to 1:30. So we'll have 15 minutes for Jessica now and 15 minutes discussion. And then after lunch we're coming back 15 minutes later at 2:15. So sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Okay, thanks. And I actually wanted to thank Hugh for coming along and representing the mining sector, because in some of the issues, and especially in relation to water, which is such a polemic issue in the Andean region, there is a tendency for companies not to engage, especially with researchers and NGOs. So thank you for that. So as I said, an overview of some of the water issues in relation to extractives. The work I'm going to present is based primarily on a study in Peru, as that's the area where I worked. I'll talk very generally about mining companies when I do mention them, and not refer to companies or projects specifically unless really necessary. And this is sort of what I want to do with the 15 minutes that I've got. I want to try to reposition the issues and debates around water from a technical level to a more political level. And so much of the issues and debates around water have focused on allocation and use, and contamination and curbing contamination, and much less emphasis has been given to what I call the changing social relations of control over water. And the political element comes in how those aspects are shaped by different interests and different discourses, rather than being sort of very superficial or face value issues. So one of the things I also wanted to highlight is going beyond allocation, competition, use, contamination, is the scope of the influence of the mining sector, and given the boom in mining in the Andean countries, in particular Peru, and different aspects of water. So while much of the debate has focused on quality, the effects of mining on quality and quantity, there's also been lots of changes in water flows, such as interbasin transfers, the nature of institutions, both national and local, especially through legal reforms, technologies, primarily infrastructure, and also the ways in which water is represented. So I'll talk about those a little bit. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that water also influences mining. And especially some of the conflicts and some of the difficulties in accessing water in regions where there isn't much water available for the extractive sector have really transformed some of the strategies and debates around mining. So some of the issues around accessing water in Peru, I think what is sometimes underestimated in the general debates around mining is the extent of water that's needed for various aspects of the process, including extraction, processing and cooling, and also disposal of waste, although some of those practices are now restricted somewhat. And this all takes place in, especially in, well, talking about Peru, in areas where there's natural scarcity due to hydrological conditions like the photo that you showed, but also the fact that a lot of the existing water is allocated or is in use, particularly by Andean communities. And I have actually had one mining company sort of raise with me the issue, well, whose water is it? You know, the Andean communities are basically saying it's their water, and it's not. The formal situation is that Andean communities have largely historic water use rights, which are legal, but they're not registered. So you've got then a juxtaposition there. By having the legal right, it's supposed to be respected by other users and in processes of allocation, but often there is no actual formal record or piece of paper to show that. And there have also been, especially historically, lots of government resolutions that have simply allocated water resources to companies, which has already created a tension when new forms of allocation are due to happen. Some of the main strategies that companies have used to access water under these conditions have been unilateral negotiations, both with communities and with the state. So the communities, much of the strategies are focused around negotiating the purchase of land, often to acquire the water, sometimes for their installations, but often to acquire the water that belongs to that land, which doesn't technically belong to the land, but it seems that in practice that water is simply being reallocated to the land, to the new landowner. And in the north especially, agreements between companies and communities to relinquish their water rights based on apparent promises that the company will take care of their water needs, especially domestic water needs, for the foreseeable future. And with the state, direct negotiations in order to release water resources, companies proposing their own studies in order to gauge the amount of water that's available, that's allocated, and that could be used by that particular project, and propositions for the building of infrastructure, such as dams, which produce both water and energy, if they're hydroelectric installations, and which are often asked for co-financing with the state on the basis that they'll provide energy to the mine, which is often a time-limited process of maybe 5 decades or something like that, but for other sectors, other water user sectors as well. And another important aspect is the participation of the mining sector in policy formulation, in particular the 2009 Water Resources Law, which was heavily influenced by the National Mining Association or Society, which is an industrial federation of mining companies who are very much present in the definition of those legal reforms. So when we talk about how mining operates in the context of that law, we must remember that that law also was shaped to a certain extent by the mining sector. And in some of the influence of the mining sector is apparent in some of the discourses and debates around water. And one of the ones that's very prevalent is sort of debate over efficiency, which of course at face value nobody can disagree with efficiency because nobody should use water wastefully. But that's often been used as sort of a discursive tool by the mining sector to justify its entry into water use on the basis that the agriculture sector is very inefficient. So there's a sort of a sub-narrative also with discourses of efficiency and also with equity. As some mining companies have complained that water is already allocated to the agriculture sector, with very little sort of room for it to get in there. So some of the issues and challenges as I think a couple of speakers have already pointed out, the role of water in conflicts around mining. And I think what's important here is that it's not just conflicts over the material of water, but the resource itself for agriculture and pasture. But there are very strong cultural dimensions to water, especially in the Andean region, which are sometimes invoked, not always by the communities, but sometimes by civil society. But the sort of historic vision of water is forming very much part of territory and ancestry. And water has also, in a way, been a vehicle or been a topic around which some of these conflicts and claims have coalesced, because it is such a symbolic resource. And I think this has been interpreted by, I think, at least three mining companies that I've talked to have sort of pointed out this perspective that communities will complain about water as leverage for compensation, even if there aren't really any effects on water. And I think that's problematic, because I think there are effects on water, but I think it shows the power of water as a symbolic resource around which to mobilise. In terms of hydraulic infrastructure, this sort of idea that the mining sector, by contributing to or building itself hydraulic infrastructure, will produce, and there's very much this sort of phrase, the production of water, the generation of new water resources for both mining and for other sectors. And this, as I see it, especially desalinated water, which is increasingly used, I think is both a mechanism to quell conflicts, social resistance about using existing water resources, and as a way of producing water that's needed for the mining operation. And given some of these conflicts, one of the mechanisms that's been proposed is participatory monitoring, whereby communities sort of observe the collection of samples and things like that, which I think is a step forward, because not all companies offer that possibility, but it seems that, and here I'm referring to some work by Matthew Himley, the communities have quite a limited role in that process, which he says is a role of observers, basically. And there's very contested interpretations of the data and analysis of those data. In fact, I was talking to somebody who had been sort of doing participant observation in some of these processes and observed what to him was clearly a diesel spill, and that was sort of passed off by the company representative as some sort of organic effluent that was really quite benign. And then his identification of that as diesel was then sort of dismissed on the basis that he wasn't an expert and qualified to identify what was diesel. I think another argument that Matthew Himley makes is that these kinds of processes around participation shouldn't be seen as a substitute for wider loss of control over water resources, either by the company and very much by the state, because after all the state has a very large stake in ensuring that mining operations go ahead and get the resources they need. And it's in this context I think that governance is important. Governance has certainly been reformed under the 2009 law, but it's important to think about what those reforms mean and for whom. So one of the key reforms is that local water user associations should be from the highlands, which have traditionally been very context specific and isolated, should be much more engaged in processes of water governance and subsumed into these river basin councils, which I see as a way of creating a new organisation in which the mining sector can participate in decisions about water, seeing as it's never participated before in a meaningful way, because most of those organisations have been led by the agriculture sector. And so in a way I think it's a way in for the mining companies. What the role of the communities is going to be in those, I don't know. And I think it also depends a lot on how participation is organised and weighted between different users. And this is an advert from actually Anglo-American in Chile, and it's about desalination. And I think some of you might be able to read that the subtitle is the most important mineral in mining is water. And this is what I was saying, about desalinate. This is about desalination. And the message is that by producing desalinated water, we're essentially taking water, we're removing ourselves from your water system. We're producing our own water. Therefore, there's no cause for concern here, which is, for me, responding to the need to both produce water for the operation and quell conflict around the use of water. But it also shows very much how the mining sector is responding to water issues and devising new messages, devising new technological strategies. So 3 last points in my last 1 minute. I think currently water is just treated so instrumentally in the debates around mining, as if it's just a matter of getting the access and the allocation right, the material resource right, whereas it's very much a vehicle for maintaining relations with local people. As I said, water forms a very strong channel for claims and discourses, both in the sense of these claims about compensation, which I think are largely misplaced, but also leverage against the agriculture sector by invoking these notions of efficiency in agriculture. So I think what's important to focus on is not sort of the material resource itself, its allocation, its use, its contamination, but how control over that water is shifting in the context of the growth of the mining sector. It happens in many more dimensions than just allocation and use. And who is getting to drive and have a say in those processes? That's what I wanted to